I want you to imagine, just for a second, a world where you literally have to pencil in a highly contagious, potentially lethal disease right into your child's calendar.
Right, like it's just a scheduled event you can't avoid.
Exactly. Because, I mean, when you think about the milestones of early life, you expect certain things, right?
Yeah.
You've got the first steps, the first day of school, uh, losing that first baby tooth.
The normal stuff.
Yeah, the normal stuff. But now, I want you to imagine if another absolutely guaranteed milestone, like a mandatory rite of passage for every single person born, was a severe, high fever, full body rash illness.
Wow, yeah. It's intense to even think about.
It really is. You knew with total unshakable certainty that your child was going to get it. You couldn't stop it. You couldn't hide them from it. You essentially just had to wait for the fever to spike, brace yourself, and pray they made it through without permanent neurological damage.
It's a scenario that feels completely alien to us today. I mean, it sounds like a premise for a dystopian film or something.
Cool.
Or maybe a recounting of life in the 14th century. It just runs entirely counter to our modern baseline expectation of childhood safety, right? Where we just assume the environment is generally sanitized of mass, unavoidable biological threats.
But the wild thing is, it's not ancient history, and it's not fiction. That was the reality in the United States mere decades ago. And that reality is the subject of our deep dive today.
Oh, yes.
We are tracking the complete American arc of measles. And we're looking at a fascinating and frankly sobering stack of sources today. We've got historical epidemiological data from the CDC. We've got granular surveillance reports spanning the year 2000 all the way through the highly volatile years of 2025 and 2026.
And some incredibly raw firsthand reflections from public health officials and physicians on the ground, too.
Yeah, exactly. So our mission is to trace this journey from a universal terror to what was undeniably a monumental triumph of science and federal deployment, straight into a live, real-time unraveling that is happening in American public health right now.
And we really need to set the stakes for this conversation immediately, because this isn't just an archival look back at how a disease was conquered.
Right.
It is a real-time documentary exploration of a historical timeline that is currently, well, it's bending backward. We are looking at a profound structural shift in American public health.
It's huge.
Now, our goal today is to remain entirely measured and objective. We are going to stick strictly to the documentation, the biology, and the data. But even when you strip away the emotion, I mean, the facts on the ground represent something staggering. We are bearing witness to the dismantling of a generational victory.
So to understand the magnitude of that victory and really the tragedy of its unraveling, we have to start at the baseline. We have to look at the world before 1963. The pre-vaccine reality.
And before times.
Yeah, the before times. And the sheer scale of the infection rates is almost impossible to wrap your head around today. According to the CDC historical data, before the vaccine, 3 to 4 million Americans were infected with measles every single year.
I really want to pause on that number because it requires some demographic context to truly appreciate. 3 to 4 million cases annually in the 1950s and early 60s. If you look at the birth rates of the United States at that time, that number essentially represents the entire birth cohort. Let that sink in.
Wow. Every single child.
Year after year, almost every single child born in America contracted measles.
It's like a biological tax on existing in society.
Yeah.
You know, you were born, you start interacting with the world, and eventually the tax collector comes. It wasn't a question of if, but entirely a question of when.
That's a highly accurate way to frame it. And to understand why the tax was so universally collected, we have to look under the hood at the biological reality of the virus itself.
Right. Let's get into the biology.
Measles, which is known clinically as rubeola, is arguably the most contagious disease known to human medicine. When epidemiologists measure contagion, they use a metric called the basic reproduction number, or R0.
Okay, R0. I've heard of that.
Yeah, you probably heard it a lot over the last few years. This number represents how many susceptible people a single infected person will transmit the virus to on average. For context, the seasonal flu usually has an R0 of around 1 to 2.
Okay.
The original strain of COVID-19 was somewhere around 2 to 3.
Okay, so if I have the flu, I might give it to 1 or 2 people if I'm not careful. What is the R0 for measles?
The R0 for measles is estimated to be between 12 and 18.
12 to 18 people from one infection. How is that even physically possible? I mean, is it just that kids are coughing directly on each other?
No, no, it's far more insidious than that. The mechanism of transmission is what makes it a masterclass in contagion. The virus aerosolizes beautifully.
Aerosolizes.
Yeah, when an infected person breathes, talks, or coughs, they expel microscopic viral particles that don't just drop heavily to the floor like larger respiratory droplets do. These aerosols hang suspended in the ambient air currents of a room.
Just floating there.
Exactly. The CDC documentation notes that the measles virus can remain infectious in the airspace of a room for up to 2 hours after the infected person has left.
Wait, really? 2 full hours. So I could walk into an empty pediatrician's waiting room, or, I don't know, empty classroom, a full hour after a sick kid was in there, breathe the air, and catch it.
Absolutely. If you are susceptible, meaning you have no immunity from a prior infection or a vaccine, your chances of catching it in that scenario are phenomenally high.
That is wild.
It is. The virus is exceptionally efficient at binding to the receptors in the human respiratory tract. Because it is so fiercely contagious, any gap in a population's immunity is immediately exploited. Before 1963, there was no immunity other than actually enduring and surviving the disease.
Right, because there was no vaccine.
So the virus simply swept through every new generation of children like an invisible tide.
But there's a massive disconnect here that I want to explore. When you look at how this era is remembered in popular culture, or even just talking to older generations, measles is often portrayed as this almost comedic inconvenience.
Right, the sitcom version.
Yeah, exactly. You see it in old television sitcoms. A kid gets spots, they have to stay home from school in their pajamas, their mom brings some ice cream and comic books, and it's treated as a mild childhood rite.
A rite of passage.
But when I look at the clinical data in our sources, it doesn't look like a sitcom.
Yeah.
If this was just a harmless rite of passage, why does the data show nearly 50,000 hospitalizations every single year?
That is the crux of the historical distortion. The documentation tells a brutally grim story that completely contradicts that cultural nostalgia. Yes, it was treated as a rite of passage, but the reality behind that myth was severe morbidity.
The numbers are intense.
We are talking about roughly 48,000 hospitalizations annually in the United States, and tragically, 400 to 500 pediatric deaths every single year.
400 to 500 children dying.
Yeah.
I mean, that is an astonishing amount of grief to just casually write off as a normal part of growing up.
And the mortality rate only captures a fraction of the devastation. We also have to look at the severe, life-altering complications. The sources detail how measles is neurotropic, which means it can cross the blood-brain barrier.
Oh, wow.
This could lead to measles encephalitis, a dangerous swelling of the brain. That condition frequently resulted in permanent neurological damage, leaving a child with lifelong intellectual disabilities, severe seizure disorders, or profound deafness.
It's devastating.
And beyond the immediate acute phase, there was an incredibly sinister, though rare, late complication known as SSPE.
Yeah, I saw that acronym in the notes. Subacute sclerosing panencephalitis. What exactly is happening in the body when someone gets that?
The mechanism of SSPE is one of the most terrifying things in virology. A child would catch measles, recover from the acute illness, and seem completely fine.
Like completely healthy.
Yes, they go back to school, they grow up. But a mutated, defective form of the measles virus manages to evade the initial immune clearance and hides deep within the central nervous system.
Inside there.
It lays utterly dormant. Then years, sometimes 7 to 10 years later, it reactivates. It begins to slowly spread across the neural synapses, causing a progressive, irreversible deterioration of the brain tissue.
Oh my God.
The child would slowly lose their cognitive abilities, then their motor functions, eventually falling into a vegetative state and passing away. It was a 100% fatal death sentence born from a routine childhood illness a decade prior.
That is genuinely horrific, and it makes the cultural amnesia even more baffling to me. If the virus was doing this, killing hundreds, hospitalizing tens of thousands, hiding in the brain to strike a decade later, why did society collectively decide to remember it as a benign annoyance with ice cream?
It comes down to a psychological coping mechanism that epidemiologists sometimes refer to as the denominator effect.
The denominator effect.
Right, because 3 to 4 million children caught it annually, and the vast, vast majority of them survived without severe complications. The sheer volume of survivors overwhelmed the societal narrative.
Oh, I see.
When 3 million people are fine, the culture develops a kind of psychological amnesia about the 500 who died and the thousands who were permanently injured. The tragic outcomes were statistically small compared to the massive denominator of total infections.
So they were basically written off as anomalies,
Yeah.
like getting struck by lightning.
Exactly. Society falsely categorized the disease as benign because the alternative was psychologically unbearable. You cannot function as a parent if you live in a constant state of terror over an unavoidable airborne disease that might kill or permanently disable your child.
Yeah, you'd go crazy.
You normalize it, you cross your fingers, you hope you land in the survivor column, and you don't look too closely at the pediatric wards.
But clearly, while the general public was normalizing it, the medical and scientific community was highly alarmed. They were looking at the raw data, and this massive annual wave of guaranteed suffering created a desperate, urgent need for a scientific breakthrough.
Yes, absolutely.
Because as I understand it, even today, there is no cure for measles, right? Like there's no pill you can take.
Correct. The treatment for a measles infection is entirely supportive. You manage the fever, you hydrate the patient, you treat secondary bacterial infections like pneumonia if they arise, and you hope their immune system can clear the virus.
Right.
But you cannot cure it. Therefore, the only viable strategy was prevention. This reality forced a shift in focus from the suffering in the general population to the quiet, meticulous, deeply complex work happening in the virology laboratories. And the true turning point in this story began in 1954.
Enter Dr. John F. Enders and Thomas Peoples.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I want to take a moment on John Enders because reading his biography in our sources, it feels like his name should be etched into the cultural consciousness right alongside Jonas Salk or Louis Pasteur.
Without question. Dr. Enders was a scientist at Harvard University, and he brought a terrifying level of genius to the measles problem. He was actually already a Nobel laureate by the time he and Peebles tackled rubeola in 1954.
Wait, he already had a Nobel Prize.
Yes. He had won the Nobel Prize for his groundbreaking work in cell culture. Specifically, he and his team were the first to figure out how to successfully grow the poliovirus in various types of human and animal tissue in a laboratory setting.
And that's a big deal because
before Enders, scientists thought the poliovirus could only grow in human nerve tissue, which is incredibly difficult and dangerous to work with.
I can imagine.
Enders figured out how to grow it in other, safer types of lab tissue. That fundamental methodological discovery was the key that unlocked the door for Jonas Salk to actually develop the polio vaccine.
So he laid the groundwork.
Enders provided the blueprint for how to mass-produce viruses safely. It's why the scientific community widely considers him the father of modern vaccines.
Okay, so the guy who basically handed Salk the tools to beat polio turns his attention to measles. And in 1954, he and his colleague Thomas Peoples managed to isolate the measles virus.
Yeah.
Now, isolating a virus sounds a bit like finding a tiny criminal in a lineup and locking him in a cell, but the actual biology of what they did is fascinating. How do you isolate an invisible airborne pathogen in 1954?
It required incredible precision. An outbreak of measles was sweeping through a private school outside of Boston. Peebles, working under Enders, went to the school and took blood and throat swabs from the 6 students.
Okay.
One of those students was an 11-year-old boy named David Edmonston. Peebles brought David's samples back to the Harvard lab. Isolating the virus meant they successfully extracted the live rubeola virus from David's cells, introduced it to a sterile cell culture in a test tube, and managed to keep it alive and multiplying.
So they essentially built a microscopic terrarium where the virus could survive outside the human body.
Yes. And once you have the virus isolated and growing in a lab environment, the game changes entirely. You can study its structure, you can test how it reacts to different compounds, but most importantly for our story, you can begin the arduous process of trying to weaken it.
And that process of weakening it is what took nearly a decade. From the isolation in 1954, it took until 1963 to turn that wild, dangerous virus from David Edmonston into a viable, licensed medical tool.
A very long process.
I want to understand the mechanism here because it's brilliant. How do you take something that naturally wants to destroy human cells and convince it to stop?
The process is called attenuation. The sources detail how Enders' team took that original virus, which became immortalized in virology as the Edmonston strain, and they began passing it through successive unnatural cell cultures.
What does that mean, passing it through, like practically speaking?
They would infect a dish of human kidney cells. The virus would multiply. Then they would take some of that new virus and use it to infect a dish of monkey kidney cells.
Okay.
The virus has to adapt to survive in the monkey cells. Then they would take it and put it into a culture of chick embryo cells.
So they are forcing it to live in alien environments. It has to adapt or die.
Precisely. Viruses are incredibly adaptable, but they have limited genetic space. As the Edmundston strain mutated to become highly efficient at infecting chick embryo cells in a petri dish, it simultaneously lost its genetic edge for infecting the human respiratory tract.
Oh, that makes sense.
If we use an analogy, it's like taking a wild apex predator timber wolf and selectively breeding it over generations in a completely different environment until you end up with a pug.
I love that. It's still technically a dog, but it's not going to take down a deer.
Exactly. The attenuated virus is the pug. It is biologically incompetent at causing severe human disease. It can't cause the massive viremia, the high fever, the encephalitis.
Right.
But, and this is the absolute genius of the live attenuated vaccine, its surface proteins, its face remain identical to the wild wolf.
Okay, so it looks the same.
So when you inject this weakened virus into a child's arm, the human immune system recognizes the foreign invader, mounts a full, robust defense, and permanently commits the virus's face to its immunological memory.
It fights the pug, memorizes the face, and then if the real wolf ever shows up, the immune system already has an army waiting.
That is exactly the mechanism. So in 1963, the live attenuated measles vaccine, derived from that very specific virus swabbed from David Edmundston's throat, was officially licensed. It fundamentally altered the landscape of pediatric medicine.
Almost overnight, physicians had a tool to prevent one of those common and devastating childhood illnesses.
Yes.
And the tool didn't stop evolving there. The sources trace the timeline forward to 1971, which is a massive milestone because that is when the measles vaccine was folded into a combination shot.
The MMR.
The MMR vaccine, exactly. Measles, mumps, and rubella. One injection, 3 major childhood terrors knocked out simultaneously. This became the new gold standard of childhood immunization.
The introduction of the MMR combination was a masterstroke of public health efficiency and behavioral economics. I mean, if you ask a parent to take time off work to bring their infant into a clinic for a measles shot, then come back 2 months later for a mumps shot, then come back later for a rubella shot, compliance is going to drop off a cliff.
Yeah, nobody has time for that.
Exactly. By consolidating them, you drastically reduce the friction. It instantly increased coverage rates across the board.
But I want to stop here and draw a really crucial distinction that our sources make. Creating the vaccine in a lab at Harvard is one thing. It's a scientific miracle.
Okay.
But having a blueprint for a fire extinguisher doesn't automatically put out a nationwide fire.
Right.
Dr. Enders built the tool, but he didn't have the power to force the country to use it.
That is a vital distinction. The laboratory discovery was entirely academic.
Yes.
It was a triumph of basic science, cellular biology, and sheer perseverance. But a vial of attenuated vaccine sitting in a cold storage unit in Massachusetts does absolutely nothing to save a child in rural Texas or urban Chicago. To extinguish a nationwide, hypercontagious biological fire, you need more than a scientific tool. You need massive, coordinated, relentless structural deployment. You need bureaucratic muscle.
Which brings us to the real heavy lifter of the deployment phase, the federal government, specifically the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Because as we look at the next phase in our sources, we see how the CDC took this academic discovery and essentially turned it into a logistical crusade.
This is where the story of measles takes a very different path than the story of polio, which we often view as the quintessential American vaccine triumph.
Oh, how so?
Well, with polio, a massive amount of the initial drive and funding was grassroots. It was fueled by organizations like the March of Dimes, mothers collecting dimes on porches, and localized state efforts.
Right, I've seen the old posters.
But with measles, the federal role was aggressively central and top-down. The CDC didn't just suggest people get the vaccine. They stepped up and set an explicit, formal, documented elimination goal.
They didn't just want to mitigate the damage. They wanted to entirely wipe the disease off the map of the United States. And the timeline for this wasn't a quick overnight success. We're looking at a sustained, grinding era spanning from roughly 1978 all the way to the year 2000.
22 years.
Over 2 decades of relentless bureaucratic campaigning. How did they actually execute that on the ground?
It required an immense, multifaceted strategy. The CDC worked in lockstep with state and local health departments. A huge piece of the puzzle was the implementation and strict enforcement of school entry requirements.
The mandates.
Yes. By mandating that children had to prove immunity to attend public school, they artificially created the massive vaccination coverage needed to achieve herd immunity. But beyond mandates, they had to build the infrastructure to deliver the vaccines, maintaining the cold chain to keep the vials refrigerated across thousands of miles, subsidizing costs for underserved populations.
And I noticed in the sources there was a major hiccup around 1989. that forced them to adapt, right? Like the shield slip.
Yes, the 1989 to 1991 resurgence is a critical chapter. Despite high vaccination rates, a massive outbreak occurred, infecting over 55,000 people and killing over 120.
Wow.
What the CDC and virologists discovered was that a single dose of the measles vaccine, while highly effective, only provoked a lasting immune response in about 93% to 95% of children.
So a small chunk of kids just didn't respond to the first shot.
Right. That 5% to 7% failure rate, when spread across millions of children, created a large enough pool of susceptible hosts for the virus to ignite.
Because the R naught is so high, the 12 to 18 number, the virus found that tiny 5% crack in the armor.
Exactly. So the bureaucratic muscle flexed again. The Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices changed the protocol to require a 2-dose schedule, one at 12 to 15 months, and a booster between 4 and 6 years old.
Okay, that makes sense.
This pushed the efficacy rate to over 97%. And alongside this, the federal government launched the Vaccines for Children, or VFC program, in 1994, which guaranteed free vaccines for children in low-income families, removing the financial barrier entirely.
But it wasn't just about handing out shots. A massive part of the CDC era was intelligence gathering, right? The surveillance network.
You cannot eliminate a highly contagious pathogen if you don't know exactly where it is circulating. The CDC, alongside state authorities, built a granular, nationwide surveillance system to track every single suspected case of measles.
It operated almost like a military radar system, didn't it?
Very much so. If a pediatrician anywhere in the country saw a child with a fever and a rash, it triggered an immediate public health protocol. Blood samples were rushed for testing. If it was confirmed, disease detectives were deployed to investigate.
Disease detectives.
Yes, they had to meticulously trace every person that child had been in contact with to isolate the infected and to aggressively ring vaccinate the surrounding community to starve the virus of fuel.
Ring vaccinate. So you basically build a wall of immune people around the sick person.
Precisely.
I want to pause on a definition that the sources emphasize here. When the CDC set an elimination goal, we need to be very clear about what the word elimination actually means in federal and epidemiological terms.
Yeah.
Because elimination is not the same thing as eradication.
This is a point of frequent public confusion, and the distinction is vital. Eradication is a global, permanent biological victory. Smallpox is eradicated. The wild variola virus no longer exists in nature anywhere on planet Earth.
Right.
Measles is not eradicated. The virus still circulates widely and wildly in many parts of the developing world and even in parts of Europe. What the CDC sought and achieved was elimination.
Okay.
Elimination means the total cessation of continuous domestic transmission within a specific geographic boundary, in this case the United States, for 12 consecutive months or more.
So if we use a metaphor, it means the massive domestic forest fire is entirely out. A spark might fly over the border from another country, but because the ground here is so thoroughly soaked with water, meaning our population is highly vaccinated, the spark can't catch.
Right.
It might burn 1 or 2 dry leaves, but it can't start a sustained, self-propagating fire.
That perfectly illustrates the concept. You might get a case imported by a business traveler returning from a country where measles is endemic. Maybe they infect their unvaccinated infant or a susceptible person sitting next to them on the plane.
Yeah.
But because the vast majority of the people they interact with are fully vaccinated, the chain of transmission hits a dead end almost immediately. It doesn't become a sprawling nationwide epidemic. The baseline remains 0.
And that monumental, decades-long effort culminated in the year 2000. The CDC officially declared measles eliminated from the United States. The domestic fire was out.
Hey, what?
I want to spend a moment dwelling on the year 2000 because our sources include these profound first-person reflections from the public health officials who lived through this era and actually signed off on that declaration. When you read their words, you can feel the immense historical weight of the moment. This was considered one of the absolute pinnacle achievements of American public health.
It was a truly historic inflection point.
Yeah.
Try to imagine dedicating your entire professional life, decades of your career, to fighting a single devastating pathogen.
Yeah.
These officials watched the numbers drop from 3 to 4 million unavoidable cases a year to thousands to hundreds and finally to 0 continuous domestic cases.
Incredible.
The epidemiologists and directors who signed that declaration in 2000 viewed it as a hard-won, almost miraculous triumph of science, steadfast policy, and public cooperation. It was tangible proof that the system worked. It proved that when the federal government, brilliant scientists, and an engaged public align their efforts, they can conquer seemingly invincible biological threats.
It was essentially the victory lap. And for the next decade or so, through the 2000s and deep into the 2010s, that elimination held strong. We had those sporadic, import-driven sparks you mentioned. Someone travels abroad, brings it back to a specific community, a small cluster happens, but the surveillance network kicked in, the high vaccination rates held the line, and the outbreaks were aggressively and quickly contained. The shield functioned exactly as designed.
It functioned beautifully. And because of that success, for an entire generation of newly minted doctors and a whole generation of new parents, measles transitioned from a visceral terror into a complete abstraction.
Right. It became a chapter in a medical history textbook, rather than a living, breathing reality in a pediatric intensive care unit.
Exactly. People stopped fearing it because they stopped seeing it.
But then, the narrative of our sources takes a sharp, highly alarming turn. And this brings us to the unraveling. We pivot from the historical triumph to the hinge year, 2025.
This is where our deep dive shifts from a historical documentary into live, volatile reporting.
It is the absolute shock of the return. Our epidemiological reports point to 2025 as the year the triumph visibly and undeniably collapsed. It is cited in the documentation as the worst U.S. measles year in over 3 decades.
It's staggering.
I want to read these numbers slowly because they are jarring. In 2025, the United States saw roughly 2,100 to 2,300 confirmed cases of measles. And this wasn't one isolated cluster in one city. This was a fractured, sprawling crisis spread across approximately 49 different outbreaks nationwide.
We must contextualize those numbers against the baseline we just established. We went from 0 continuous domestic cases in the year 2000 and subsequent years where the total national case count might hover around 50 or 80 from isolated imports to suddenly jumping to over 2,000 cases actively burning across dozens of states.
It's a massive jump.
It represents a systemic failure of the immunological shield. And when we look at the granular epidemiological facts of who was contracting the virus, the data is incredibly clear and unforgiving. About 93% of these cases in 2025 occurred in unvaccinated individuals.
93%. So the virus wasn't mutating to evade the vaccine. The tool still worked.
The vaccine was perfectly fine.
The virus was simply finding exactly who it was biologically programmed to find. It was finding the human gaps in the armor. And tragically, the return of the disease meant the immediate return of the worst possible outcomes. The sources solemnly note that in 2025, there were 3 confirmed pediatric deaths from measles.
To a layman, 3 deaths out of a population of hundreds of millions might sound statistically small, especially compared to the 500 deaths a year in the 1950s.
Sure.
But we have to remember the context of the elimination era. This tragedy occurred after an entire prior decade with essentially 0 deaths. We went from absolute safety back to lethal outcomes from a disease we had entirely defeated 25 years prior. It is a shocking, heartbreaking regression in public health.
And you really feel that shock in the documentation. One of our sources includes a deeply moving reflection from a physician who is practicing medicine, living through this resurgence right now in 2025, and the cognitive dissonance they describe is surreal.
It really is.
I want you, the listener, to try to put yourself in their shoes for a second. Imagine spending years in medical school, surviving your residency, memorizing the endless complexities of human pathology. And you spend your entire early career reading about measles as if it were polio, or the bubonic plague, a defeated enemy relegated to the past.
Right.
You study the historical photographs of the rash. You learn how to identify the tiny white coptic spots that appear inside the mouth, but you never, ever actually expect to use that knowledge. And then suddenly, on a random Tuesday, a child walks into your waiting room.
There it is.
They are highly febrile, they have a hacking cough, conjunctivitis, and that distinct spreading rash. The history book is literally sitting on the exam table in front of you, and it is breathing highly contagious aerosols into your clinic.
The psychological whiplash for medical professionals is profound. The reflection highlights a terrifying realization. Public health progress is not permanent.
Not at all.
A victory declared in the year 2000 is not a static monument. It is a dynamic state that requires continuous, daily, relentless maintenance to remain a victory in 2025. And clearly, measurably, that maintenance faltered.
Which raises the most urgent, complex question of our deep dive. How did the shield drop so quickly? Why did this happen?
That's the million-dollar question.
Now, I want to be incredibly clear with you, the listener, about how we are going to navigate this next section. We are now entering live, deeply contested, and highly politically charged history. Our goal here is not to editorialize.
Right, no taking sides.
We are not here to tell you which political faction is right or to preach about who's to blame. Our mandate, based strictly on the sources provided, is to impartially present the facts, the data, and the competing interpretations of why this resurgence is happening.
And it is a fierce, ongoing debate, precisely because the stakes involve the health of children. When public health analysts and sociologists look at the competing interpretations of the 2025 resurgence, they generally categorize them into two broad perspectives, though it's crucial to understand they are deeply intertwined.
Okay.
For the sake of clarity, we can view this through perspective A, which focuses heavily on the community and behavioral level, and perspective B, which focuses on the structural and federal level.
Let's explore the community perspective first. Perspective A. What is the argument there?
The community-level perspective argues that the resurgence is primarily driven by falling MMR vaccination rates within specific localized populations.
Okay.
The argument posits that modern vaccine hesitancy, which is fueled by a complex web of internet misinformation, a decay in trust toward medical institutions, or simply a generational forgetting of how severe the disease actually is, has led an increasing number of parents to delay or outright refuse the MMR vaccine for their children.
And because of that R-naught math we talked about earlier, the 12 to 18 number, the margin for error is essentially zero.
Right. Precisely. Because measles is so unbelievably contagious, you need a phenomenally high vaccination rate, generally cited as around 95%, to maintain the herd immunity that protects the immunocompromised and the infants too young to be vaccinated.
Right.
If a specific community, a school district, or a religious enclave drops below that 95% threshold, even down to 90%, it creates a viable pocket of susceptibility. And because the virus is always just a single international airplane right away, eventually an imported case arrives, finds that specific unprotected pocket, and an outbreak explodes.
So under this perspective, the scientific tool, the vaccine, still works perfectly,
Yeah.
but the societal willingness to use the tool has degraded, creating physical holes in the net.
Exactly.
Okay, what about the other side of the debate? Perspective B, the structural argument.
Perspective B, the structural or compounding view, shifts the lens away from individual parental choices and focuses on the institutional framework. This argument suggests that the failure is a result of a retreating, weakening federal immunization posture.
So it's systemic.
Yes. Critics from this viewpoint argue that the robust, muscular public health apparatus that the CDC built so meticulously in the 80s and 90s has been actively dismantled or severely underfunded. They point to a lack of proactive public health messaging, a failure by agencies to effectively and rapidly counter digital misinformation, and political policy shifts at the state level that have broadened exemptions and made it administratively much easier to opt out of vaccination requirements.
So this perspective is saying it's not simply that individual people woke up one day and became hesitant, it's that the massive institutions whose explicit job it is to maintain the shield have stepped back from their posts and allowed the infrastructure to crumble.
That's the argument, yes.
I always find this intersection fascinating because these two perspectives aren't mutually exclusive. It's like society built a massive, glorious, structurally sound dam in the year 2000. We held a ribbon-cutting ceremony and celebrated our mastery over nature.
Right.
But now, in 2025, there are deep cracks appearing in the concrete, and the valley below is starting to flood. And the people standing on top of the dam are fiercely arguing over the cause.
Fighting while the water rises.
Exactly. One group says the cracks are there because the specific materials we relied on, community trust and parental participation, are degrading. The other group says the cracks are there because we fired the maintenance crew, slashed the budget, and stopped paying for the daily upkeep of the dam. But while they argue over the root cause,
The water is coming through.
the water is coming through.
That is the essential, undeniable takeaway from the data. Society will and must debate the root causes of the shifting policies, the cultural hesitancy, and the institutional failures. But as analysts of the documentation, we must ground this discussion entirely in the undisputed epidemiological facts.
Right. Regardless of the why, the numbers are rising, the outbreaks are happening, the protective shield has demonstrably dropped, and the resulting cases are overwhelmingly, undeniably concentrated among the unvaccinated population. The biological reality of the measles virus has no interest in our policy debates. It only cares about finding a susceptible host cell to replicate in. And as we move into the final phase of our timeline, we see that the virus kept finding those hosts with terrifying efficiency. Because the story didn't peak and resolve in 2025, the surveillance reports take us into 2026, and the data shows the case count simply kept climbing. The floodwaters kept rising higher.
Which triggers a very formal, very serious, and highly consequential bureaucratic process. We discussed earlier how the elimination status achieved in the year 2000 was an official, verified declaration.
Yes.
Well, that status is not a permanent title. It is conditional. If the facts on the ground change, if continuous domestic transmission resumes, there are international bureaucratic mechanisms designed to revoke that status.
And our sources mention that this involves an international body called PAHO. Can you explain who they are and what role they play in this?
PAHO stands for the Pan-American Health Organization. They serve as the specialized international health agency for the Americas, and they essentially act as the regional office for the World Health Organization.
Okay.
Crucially, they are the independent international body responsible for rigorously certifying whether a country in the Americas has achieved or maintained disease elimination status. You cannot simply have the CDC declare, "We are still free of measles."
Oh, I see. You need a third party to verify it.
Yes. That claim has to be verified by PAS via an external review of extensive epidemiological data, genetic sequencing of the virus strains to prove they are imports and not endemic, and proof of surveillance quality.
So PHO has been closely watching the exploding case numbers throughout 2025 and 2026. And the sources reveal a critical, highly alarming development regarding their review process. PHO is scheduled to review the United States elimination status, but because the outbreak situation is so volatile and sustained, they actually pushed their formal review to November of 2026.
Yes. In the world of international public health, a delay of that nature is highly significant. It indicates that the data submitted by the United States is deeply concerning, borderline, and requires extensive granular analysis to determine if continuous transmission has breached the 12-month mark.
It's too close to call.
Exactly. But while the formal review is delayed, the consensus among public health analysts in the sources is grim. They project that it is highly likely that the United States will officially lose its measles elimination status.
Highly likely to lose the status it fought for decades to achieve and held for a quarter of a century. If we look at the implications of that, what does that actually mean on a practical level? If PHO comes out in November 2026, looks at the data and says the United States is no longer considered to have eliminated measles, what are the real-world consequences of that revocation?
The consequences are profound, operating on both a symbolic and a deeply practical level. Symbolically, it is a devastating, historic blow to the prestige, perceived competence, and leadership of American public health on the global stage.
Wow.
It is an official, internationally recognized acknowledgement that a first-world superpower with immense medical resources has fundamentally regressed on a core metric of basic childhood health.
It's the official, stamped documentation of the unraveling.
Precisely. But the practical consequences are even more severe. Losing elimination status means that measles is now considered endemic again.
Endemic, so let's hear now.
Yes. It means the virus is continuously circulating and sustaining itself within the borders of the country without needing to be imported. This forces a massive, costly reallocation of public health resources. Instead of just maintaining a perimeter shield against the occasional imported spark, local health departments have to constantly expend resources fighting active, domestic, self-sustaining brush fires.
And it changes the daily calculus for vulnerable people.
Entirely. It puts immunocompromised individuals, pediatric cancer patients, and infants who are too young to receive their first dose of the MMR vaccine at constant daily risk of encountering a lethal airborne virus in their own communities.
It's terrifying.
It transitions the entire national narrative surrounding infectious disease. We are moving from studying how did American public health win to actively managing what happened as it is dismantled.
That transition is chilling. And it brings us to the synthesis of everything we've covered today, because our sources clearly frame this arc of measles as the ultimate bridge. It is the perfect, terrifying illustration of a genuine, federally led public health triumph, achieved over decades of grueling work via the CDC's deployment of Dr. Ender's brilliant vaccine that is visibly, measurably unraveling in real time.
And the analysts in our documentation suggest it serves as the prologue, the leading edge, for a much broader systemic phenomenon they are calling the immunization retreat.
The immunization retreat.
Measles is just the most visible, the most hyper-contagious canary in the coal mine. Because its R0 is so unbelievably high, it is mathematically guaranteed to be the first disease to return when the societal shield of vaccination weakens even slightly.
Right, it's the fastest one through the door.
But the underlying mechanics suggest it won't be the last. If the infrastructure and compliance drop enough for measles, they will eventually drop enough for mumps, for rubella, for pertussis, and for polio.
It sets the stage for a much darker era if the current trajectory holds.
Yeah.
But before we wrap up, I want to make sure we bring this massive historical narrative back to the most important point, directing this to you, the listener. Because when we spend an hour talking about R-naught values, PA-AJO, bureaucratic reviews, CDC data sets, and international elimination status, I mean, it can start to feel incredibly abstract.
I can't.
It can feel like a debate over points on a bureaucratic scoreboard.
It is absolutely essential to ground this in the physical reality. This isn't abstract. This shift in status directly impacts the physical safety of American children today.
Right.
The baseline safety, the presumed invisible invulnerability that parents enjoyed in the 2010s is fracturing. We are looking at a returning vulnerability that harkens straight back to the pre-1963 era we started our discussion with.
It's full circle.
The biological reality of the rubeola virus hasn't changed a single bit. It is just as contagious and just as dangerous as it was in 1950. The only thing that has changed is our societal defense against it.
And that leaves us with a final, somewhat haunting thought to ponder as we close out this deep dive. Something that isn't explicitly charted in the CDC graphs, but echoes loudly through all these historical sources.
Yeah.
When an eliminated disease comes roaring back, it brings up a terrifying question about human nature and collective memory. We saw how the visceral lived memory of those 500 children dying every year in the 1950s drove the desperate creation of the vaccine. It drove the massive, unquestioning public compliance with the CDC campaigns.
People remembered the horror.
Exactly. But now, decades later, that visceral memory has entirely faded. We rely on the ghost of how bad things were to convince ourselves to keep taking our medicine. So what happens to a society when the generation that actually remembers the suffering is gone? Do we have to endure the tragedy and learn the hardest lessons all over again?